The fighting had finally stopped. 4 long years. You hear that quote about the fires of hell being put out on Armistice Day, and yeah, it feels right.
A sense of relief, definitely.
But if you actually picture Paris, early 1919, it wasn't a party, not at all. It was a city, a world, really just grappling with, well, feeling broken.
Absolutely broken. The scale of the loss is, it's still staggering to think about. Your sources mention figures like 17 million total deaths, soldiers, civilians, combat, disease, hunger.
Yeah, just incomprehensible number.
And the physical destruction, I mean, especially across France and Belgium, it wasn't just battlefields. Sources talk about whole areas looking like the moon.
Houses gone, factories, railways.
Hundreds of thousands of homes, yeah. Thousands of factories. Imagine Ypres.
Yeah.
Just flattened. There was this huge cloud hanging over everything: grief, anger, loss.
So the massive question then becomes,
Yeah.
how on earth do you build peace after that? After a catastrophe that immense? And maybe just as important, who gets to decide what that peace looks like?
Yeah. Well, that brings us to the Paris Peace Conference. It kicks off in January 1919. Delegates arrive from, 32 countries?
Yeah, 32. And there was hope, wasn't there? You read things like Wilson wanting to lift the frightful weight of war, Lloyd George saying the world was thirsting for peace.
Huge hopes.
Yeah.
But the reality was the big decisions, the really crucial stuff, came down to 3 men, the big 3.
Right. And the core issue, I suppose, is that while they all wanted peace, they had completely different ideas about how to get it.
Very different. And we've been looking at some fascinating source material for this deep dive, haven't we? Things written at the time, speeches, later reflections.
Yeah, they really give you a window into what these leaders were thinking, the pressures they were under, and importantly, how historians and how you, especially if you're studying this for your IGCSEs, can think about the significance of it all.
Exactly. It's not just about dates and names. The sources push you to ask why it matters. Why are we still talking about this?
So our mission today is to unpack the aims of these 3 men, try to understand why they clashed so much in that room, and explore why this whole topic and this idea of historical significance is so vital for you to get to grips with. Okay, let's jump in.
Okay, so 1919, to really get the context, you have to keep coming back to the sheer human cost. Over 65 million men fought worldwide.
65 million.
Military deaths alone, over 8 million. Then nearly 9 million civilians died from war-related causes: starvation, disease. It scarred a whole generation.
And the physical damage, as you said, it wasn't abstract. Sources paint this picture of utter ruin in places like France and Belgium. Homes, farms, bridges, the basic stuff of life, just gone.
It genuinely felt to some people like the world might never recover, like civilization itself was perhaps broken beyond repair.
And then there's the way the war actually ended. The armistice, November 1918, Germany agreed to stop fighting. Crucially, though, they stopped because they couldn't carry on militarily.
Right. And as one source points out, they didn't really see it as a surrender in the traditional sense. They felt they were stopping based on President Wilson's ideas, his 14 points that he announced earlier, promises of a fairer peace.
Which immediately set up problems, didn't it? Because when the actual terms came later,
the Germans felt utterly betrayed, lied to.
And critically, unlike peace treaties often before, Germany wasn't invited to negotiate. The Allies decided the terms amongst themselves.
And then just presented them to Germany, take it or leave it, which of course they couldn't really leave.
That's the diktat, the dictated peace.
Yeah.
And that word itself tells you how it's received in Germany. Deep resentment from the start.
Although it's fair to remember, as the sources do mention, Germany hadn't exactly been gentle itself. When Russia pulled out of the war in 1917, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk Germany imposed was incredibly harsh.
Right, they took huge amounts of land, resources.
They did, and that memory, definitely played a part in the Allies feeling justified and being tough on Germany now. It wasn't entirely one-sided harshness.
Okay, so picture the scene. Europe is devastated. Unimaginable loss, grief, anger, huge pressure to stop this ever happening again, big hopes for a better world, but also this German resentment simmering over the diktat and the memory of Brest-Litovsk hanging there too. Into this walks the big 3.
Yes. Georges Clemenceau for France, Woodrow Wilson for the USA, David Lloyd George for Britain.
There's that quote, isn't there? Supposedly Lloyd George joked about sitting between Jesus Christ and Napoleon.
Huh. Yeah, whether he actually said it or not, it's brilliant, isn't it? It just perfectly sums up the clash of personalities and visions in that room. You've got Wilson, the idealist, maybe the Jesus Christ figure wanting to save the world.
And Clemenceau, the hard-headed pragmatist, maybe the Napoleon focused entirely on France.
Exactly. And Lloyd George trying to navigate between them.
And the fundamental point is they all agreed, absolutely, never again. World War I could not be repeated.
No question. But they disagreed profoundly, sometimes really bitterly, on how you achieve that. How do you actually stop it? Their war experiences were different, their countries needed different things, their personalities clashed.
So let's break them down. Clemenceau first. The tiger. France. What was his absolute #1 priority, according to the sources?
Security
Yeah.
and punishment. You have to remember, France had suffered terribly. Huge casualties, yes, but also the war was fought on their land.
He had lived through German invasion before, too, hadn't he? 1870.
Exactly, twice in his lifetime. So for him, it was personal, it was national, he wanted revenge, he wanted Germany to pay for all the damage, absolutely. But more than that, he wanted Germany weakened, crippled, essentially, so it could never threaten France again.
You really see that in his own words, in that source where he's arguing with Wilson and Lloyd George. He basically says, you guys are safe. America's got an ocean. Britain's got the channel. We're right here next door.
You are both sheltered. We are not. That vulnerability is key. It explains why he was so relentless, so determined to get harsh terms.
And that infamous quote attributed to him. There are 20 million Germans too many.
Yeah, brutal. But it shows the depth of that feeling. He was reflecting what many, many French people felt after enduring so much. Germany had to be permanently reduced.
Okay, complete change of pace now.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, America. He came from academia, a history professor. His whole approach feels, well, different.
Worlds apart, really. Wilson's vision was much more idealistic, global even. America hadn't suffered invasion. Their losses, while significant, weren't on the same scale as France or Britain's total mobilization. They came in later, bringing the sense of maybe moral authority.
And this is where his 14 points come in, right? His big plan for peace announced back in 1918.
Yes, his blueprint for a fundamentally new way of doing things.
What were the key ideas in there?
Well, things like disarmament, but for everyone, not just Germany. The idea of self-determination, letting nations in Eastern Europe decide their own future instead of being part of big empires. And the big one for him.
The League of Nations.
Absolutely. The League was central, an international forum where countries could resolve disputes peacefully through discussion, not war.
There's that quote in Source B where Wilson says America fought because violations touched them to the quick, and they wanted a world fit and safe to live in for all nations, safe from force and selfish aggression. Sounds very principled.
It was. For Wilson, this wasn't just about settling scores with Germany. It was about redesigning the whole international system.
And the sources suggest he was pretty fixated on the League, maybe even to the annoyance of others.
Apparently so. Lloyd George's secretary noted how Wilson kept steering every conversation back to the League, even when they thought they'd settled something else. It really shows how crucial he believed it was.
Okay, thirdly, David Lloyd George, Britain's prime minister. His position seems trickier, more complex.
Definitely more complex. You have to remember his political situation.
Yeah.
He just won a big election, the khaki election, in December 1918.
And Source D shows what he'd promised the public, right? Make Germany pay, squeeze them till the pips squeak, that sort of thing.
Exactly. That's what the British public, after years of war and loss, wanted to hear. Hang the Kaiser. Make them pay.
But then you look at Source C, what he was saying privately or to Parliament before Paris, it's different. We want a peace which will be just, but not vindictive.
Above all, we want to protect the future against a repetition of the horrors of this war. That's the tightrope he was walking.
So public demands for harshness versus his private fear that being too harsh might just cause another war later on.
Precisely. He understood that crippling Germany completely, leaving them resentful and desperate, could sow the seeds for future conflict. So he was trying to find a middle path, somewhere between Clemenceau's desire for maximum punishment and Wilson's perhaps overly idealistic approach.
And he had Britain's own interests to consider too, presumably.
Of course. Maintaining Britain's naval dominance, protecting and maybe expanding the British Empire, getting trade going again. Britain was a trading nation. The war had badly damaged that. These were definitely on his agenda.
So you put these three men with these incredibly different backgrounds, national needs, personalities, public pressures. You put them in a room together for months.
Yeah, it's hardly surprising they disagreed so fiercely, is it? The negotiations were bound to be difficult.
Let's just quickly pull together those reasons for the disagreements. France experienced the war on its own land, desperate for security. Britain, an islet global empire focused on trade and balance of power. America, distant, entered late, idealistic vision for a new world order.
Their national interests were often contradictory. Security for France might mean crippling Germany economically, which could hurt British trade. Wilson's self-determination could threaten Britain and France's empires.
And their visions for the future just didn't align. Punishment versus fairness versus a kind of pragmatic stability.
Plus, personalities definitely mattered, and the pressure from voters back home was immense, especially for Lloyd George. You can see that clash between his election promises and his private views.
The sources pose some really useful questions here for analysis, don't they? Like, how would each leader answer? How much should Germany pay?
Or, what's the best way to prevent another war? Their answers would be totally different, and that reveals everything about their aims and why they clashed.
And all these disagreements inevitably got baked into the final treaty, the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, making it a document full of compromises and contradictions.
A flawed piece, many would argue.
Okay, so we've got the picture, the context, the players, their aims, the clashes. Now, let's talk about something really vital for your IGCSE. Studies this idea of historical significance.
Right, because it's not enough just to know the facts, who said what the treaty terms were. Significance is about understanding why it all matters. Why is this event important in the bigger story of history?
And getting your head around this is crucial for doing well in your essays, your analysis.
Definitely. It's about making judgments based on evidence.
The sources we looked at actually offer some good frameworks for thinking about significance. First off, what does studying this treaty and the actions of the Big Three tell us about the world at that specific time?
Yeah, what does it reveal about how leaders and ordinary people felt after this unprecedented war? What were their hopes, their fears, their assumptions?
You can also look at significance through different lenses, can't you? Like the political impact, changing borders, creating new countries, the League, or the economic impact, reparations, debt, social impact.
Absolutely. How did it affect ordinary Germans? Or people in the new nations, or soldiers returning home.
And then there's thinking about impact across time and over time. So immediate impact, how many people were affected right away, how deeply, how long did those immediate effects last, how big a deal was it considered then?
The immediate reaction. And then, crucially, looking over time, was Versailles a real turning point? Did it fundamentally change what came next? Or was it more like just one step in a longer process?
And have people's views on the treaty, on Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, changed over the last 100 years? Because interpretations definitely evolve.
Oh, massively. Historians constantly reassess based on new evidence or changing perspectives. Thinking about how interpretations differ is a key historical skill.
The sources really challenge you, the listener, with some big questions on this, like, was the main significance of the treaty its failure? The fact it didn't stop World War II?
Or maybe was the significance actually the attempt itself, this huge, unprecedented international effort to manage peace and prevent war, even if it didn't ultimately succeed. Was that significant in itself?
Did it show the limits of just having a few powerful leaders decide the fate of millions?
Or perhaps the importance of public opinion, that leaders aren't free agents, they have to respond to what their people want. Or how treaties and historical events can get twisted later for political gain.
Exploring these questions, using those ideas, context, impact across time, impact over time, different interpretations. That's how you build your own convincing arguments about significance. It's what takes your understanding beyond just description for your IGCSE work.
Yeah, it makes it much more interesting, too. It becomes a puzzle to figure out, not just a list of facts to memorize.
So let's try and wrap this up. The peace settlement after World War I, it wasn't simple. It wasn't just, let's punish Germany. It was messy, difficult, driven by trauma, driven by wildly different aims from the three most powerful men.
Shaped by their nation's vastly different experiences of the war, their competing interests, and the immense pressure they were under.
And that diktat element, the fact Germany had no say, that created a legacy of bitterness right from the start, didn't it?
Absolutely. A key factor in what happened next.
So today, we've taken a deep dive into that world of 1919, into the minds of Clemenceau, Wilson, and Lloyd George. We've looked at the context, their aims, why they clashed, and crucially, we've talked about how you can use the concept of historical significance to really analyze and understand this period for your IGCSE studies.
It really underscores just how incredibly hard it is to make lasting peace, especially after such profound conflict, maybe even impossible sometimes.
Okay, a final thought for you to mull over. Thinking about significance again, looking back now, over a century later at Versailles and the Big Three, what do you think was the most significant thing about it all? Was it the failure? Was the attempt? Was it sowing the seeds for the next war? The creation of the League, perhaps? Or something else? What lessons, if any, can we actually learn from their arguments and compromises in Paris about leadership, about making peace? That's something historians are still debating, and definitely something worth thinking about yourself.